Hi, my name is Joseph Leonard Jr., and my presentation is on Is the U.S. and China on the brink of a war? It is mainly going to be focused on the trade war and the effects that it had. To give a brief background on their friendship, this first slide is titled Chimerica, the Ideal Friendship. It started in 1973. U.S. President Richard Nixon and China's leader Mao Zedong had a mutual agreement. In this agreement, it basically said that China legitimate government would be recognized as Beijing, and that China would recognize U.S.'s leadership in the Asia Pacific region. Um, the U.S. and China were essentially dependent of one another. Um, in simpler terms, they were dependent of each other. They couldn't live without one another. Their economies were basically intertwined. Um, China's exports would fall without the U.S. demand. This is basically saying that America did the spending, um, the Chinese did the saving, America did the importing, and Chinese did the exporting. Chimerica breakup. This all started with the global financial crisis in 2008. Um, this caused for China to become more assertive on trade and geopolitics. Um, China believed it was much stronger from an economic standpoint than the U.S. The U.S. was borrowing lots of money in order to finance their spending binge that they essentially could not afford. Um, the Chinese basically seen this as weak from the U.S., and this sort of angered Donald Trump when he was still in office, which essentially started their decline of a relationship. Um, so yeah, now we examine the trade war. This is basically the first part where things started to spiral downhill. It started in 2016 after the election of Donald Trump. This was maybe a couple months after his election. Donald Trump basically placed tariffs and non-tariff restrictions on Chinese imports. However, China also placed tariffs on an array of products from the U.S. This sort of was known as the Tariff War. Um, from Chinese standpoint, China stopped buying their main source of import from the U.S. This was agricultural goods like soybeans, things of that nature. Um, this is their main goal of this was for U.S. farmers to be angry at Donald Trump for coming at China with these import tariffs, and the farmers weren't really having it. They still supported Trump. They basically said that this would be, you know, great for the American economy in the long run. Um, the Trump administration raised tariffs from 10% to 25% during this time on almost 200 billion worth of Chinese goods, $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. The Chinese basically didn't like this. They seen Trump and his actions as a bullying mindset. They were still trying to be coarse and collective with this whole situation, but Trump honestly wasn't having it. The Trump administration banned U.S. companies from working with some Chinese companies in fear that the Chinese were stealing intellectual property and spying on the government. Um, Trump actually um, had visa restrictions on Chinese students coming from into the U.S. for certain studies, and it basically in fear that they were stealing some of the government's information and their intellectual property, which sort of upset China even more. So, towards the later of Trump's term, on January 15th in 2020, China and the U.S. signed the Phase 1 agreement. This agreement was basically a mutual agreement that sort of was trying to de-escalate um, their trade war effects because, like I said before, they could not live without one another. Their economies were basically intertwined. The goal of this was to settle the trade war conflict between China and the U.S. Some topics examined included intellectual property protection, technology transfer, trade in food and agricultural products, and some new market access in China for financial services, and many more. It cut tariff escalation in half. The U.S. cut tariffs from 15% to 7.5%. This was a huge step in the right direction in terms of de-escalating the conflict. So, what does the future hold between U.S. and China? China just wants the U.S. to respect them as a rising power in the world from an economy standpoint. Um, they essentially are number two in the world from an economy standpoint. with U.S. ahead at number one. So they just wanted them to respect that and know that they are not playing around with the economic standpoint. After President Biden has attempted to de-escalate the conflict with China even more after the Phase 1 agreement. The Biden administration called for reinstatement on tariff exemptions on some Chinese goods. This is them basically just, staying in competition with China that that helps the U.S. even more. However, China has also began building their military power even more since the trade war. In the U.S.'s eyes, this doesn't really exactly mean that they're ready for war or ready to go to war with America. However, it does sort of give them a funny feeling that, like, you know, if anything were to happen between the two, they will be ready. The Biden administration also kept close eyes on Chinese economic moves. This is a smart decision by the U.S. because they know they're in competition. They noticed that some Chinese companies are actually withdrawing from the U.S. stock exchange. This, you know, in America's eyes, this is them saying that they're still competing with America, obviously, and they don't really want to be a part with America's economy. This will make Chinese and U.S. relations even more competitive than it already has been before, like I stated. So, in conclusion, if the Biden administration and China continue to work on the tension, I believe the conflict could de-escalate in the future. However, if China and the U.S. continue to have fuzzy relationship, like seen from the future hold slide, I believe that it could turn into another Cold War with China in terms of a financial standpoint or an economic standpoint. However, I believe this conflict will eventually result in a mutual disagreement. I don't really think this would, you know, extend beyond that or into violent war, just because it's just economic reasons. Um, just like it had before. Just like it had been before the trade war issue started. Um, Honestly, like, yeah, the Chinese have been stacking up their military, but I don't really believe it's purely connected into the economic conflict with America. I do believe some of it has to do with the Russia and Ukraine crisis that's going on right now. Just in case. Any questions? And here are my references. Thank you.